When I was 7 years old, a group of soldiers stormed into my home, arresting everyone. With red eyes, my stepmother held me in her room, dressed me in my brother's clothes, and then pushed me out the door. Soon, I was hauled onto a prison cart by the soldiers. I cried loudly all along the way. I thought that if only my cries were loud enough, my parents would come to rescue me. It wasn't until I heard the escorting officer say, "All family members are to be imprisoned and executed," that I finally understood Mother wanted me to die in my brother's place. Once I realized this, I stopped crying. I sat quietly in the cell, waiting for death. In the imperial prison, I listened to the guards chatter. That was how I learned my father was framed for treason. My aunt, who was an imperial consort, had also been forced to drink poisoned wine. A few days later, someone took me out of the prison. That was the first time I met Fan Yueming. At the time, he was only 20 years old, yet he was already the head eunuch. He led me to the castration room, ordering them to prepare me. But when the worker reported that I was a girl, he was momentarily stunned. "You're not Chen Pingan?" He then frowned slightly, leaning down to look at me. "Are you Chen Wanqing?" I nodded blankly. He sighed. Then he told me, "From today on, your name is Chunlan. And you are a mute." Later, I became a laundry maid in the clothing bureau. One day, because I accidentally ruined a garment, the head maid punished me by making me kneel in the corridor. The winter wind howled through the narrow passage. I curled up on the ground, shivering uncontrollably. Suddenly, in the darkness, I was struck hard by someone. I fell face first onto the ground in pain. I looked back, and found it was a boy about my age. He was dressed just as thinly as I was, yet he shouted at me in a fierce, childish voice. Where did this wild girl come from? Scaring people here in the middle of the night. I was exhausted and hungry, and my temper flared up instantly. "And where did you come from, you little eunuch? Don't you have eyes when you walk?" He was instantly enraged. He pushed me down violently, then sat on top of me and started pulling at my hair. I flailed my arms beneath him, viciously scratching at his mouth. Finally, I landed a kick right on target. He let out a sharp cry, falling over to one side. He curled up, gasping in the cold air, and then burst into loud sobs. I sat up, remembering that just a month ago, I was still the precious daughter of a general's manor. I also began to cry out of sheer grievance. The two of us lay in the dark, deserted corridor, crying for a long time, until our bodies began to tremble from the cold. The boy broke the silence with a sniffle. "My name is Situ Qingshu. I am the fourth prince." What is your name?" "My name is Chen Wanqing." I was probably dazed from crying. By the time I realized what I had said, it was already too late. Unexpectedly, Situ Qingshu suddenly jumped up. He looked at me excitedly. "You're my cousin from the Chen family?" "My mother was consort Chen." "Your aunt?" "I am your cousin." I gave him a faint glance, not understanding why he was so excited. I couldn't even rely on my own mother or brother, let alone this cousin I had never met before. Then, Situ Qingshu pulled me up. "Come, go to my room to warm up." I was too tired, so I let him lead me as I limped along for a long distance. Finally, we entered a small hut. He lit a dim oil lamp. Only then did I realize my cousin's life was also miserable. The furnishings in the room were no better than those in a eunuch's quarters. He told me to sit down, then found a basket of charcoal in the corner. I knew that was the lowest grade of black charcoal used by servants, yet he carefully picked out 2 pieces, looked back at me shivering, gritted his teeth, and added 2 more. The stove was lit. The heavy smoke made my eyes water, but it did indeed feel much warmer. Situ Qingshu first took off his outer coat and climbed into bed, shivering under the covers until his teeth chattered. After a while, he lifted a corner of the blanket, beaming as he gestured to me. "Wanqing, I've warmed up the bed. Come in quickly." The two of us lay there, beneath the cold and stiff blanket, huddled closely together. To keep each other warm, 2 children who had lost their mothers talked aimlessly about them. My mother, she was very good to me. She would make delicious peach blossom cakes, she would braid my hair beautifully, and she even embroidered the prettiest flowers on my little shoes. But in her heart, I could never compare to my brother. Having said that, I covered my face with the blanket. My tears soaked through, making the blanket feel even colder and stiffer. Situ Qingshu felt my trembling, and reached out an arm to hold me tight. "Wanqing, from today on, we are each other's closest family. I will protect you. As long as we are together, we have nothing to fear." Leaning into his embrace that smelled of soap, I nodded gently. His warm cheek pressed against my forehead, and he held my cold little hand under the covers. Many years later, I would still often think of this night, though I could never hold his warm hand again. The next day, while I was still dreaming, I was dragged out of the covers. In the early winter morning, the bone-chilling air froze me awake. A shrill voice came, "Oh my. I've really seen everything now. A 7-year-old girl has already learned to climb into beds." A head maid spoke with a long, mocking drawl, screaming exaggeratedly in my ear. I was being yanked by my ear, struggling to understand what climbing into bed meant. The maid let out a sneer. "Haha, too bad she climbed into the wrong bed. A fallen phoenix is worth less than a chicken." Following her contemptuous gaze, I looked over. At that moment, Situ Qingshu was being held by a eunuch by the arms, shouting loudly, while kicking and struggling wildly. Let him go. Let him go. Just then, a cold voice came from outside the door. This early in the morning. What are you all doing? The room full of maids and eunuchs instantly quieted down and bowed. I looked closely. It was Fang Yueming. He resolved the situation for us. In the many years that followed, he always played such a role. After the head maid and eunuchs left, Fang Yueming sat leisurely on the mahogany chair, taking a slow sip of tea. Then he said to the two of us, remember, anyone with the surname Liu is your enemy. I knew the Empress Dowager and the Empress were both surnamed Liu. The Liu clan dominated the court. The current prime minister was the Empress Dowager's brother and the Empress's father. The Grand Marshal holding military power was also the prime minister's son. It was Prime Minister Liu who framed my father for treason, which led to the destruction of my family. The Lius were not just my and Situ Qingshu's enemies. They were also Fang Yueming's enemies. He told us that he too was once a noble young master. The emperor, who was then a prince, along with my father and aunt, were a group of 4 who grew up together as childhood friends. Later, the Fang family was framed by Prime Minister Liu. Overnight, at 13, he became a palace slave. Suddenly, he lowered his voice and leaned toward me and Situ Qingshu. The emperor also wants to bring down the Liu family. If you two can help, when it's done, the 4th prince will be the crown prince. Hearing the words crown prince, Situ Qingshu's eyes lit up for a moment. I no longer had any attachments to this world, but revenge could be considered a reason for me to keep living. Moreover, I could also help Situ Qingshu. So when Fang Yueming wanted me to be a spy by the empress's side, I did not object. In early winter, heavy snow began to fall. I carried freshly washed clothes to Fingyi Palace. In the courtyard outside the palace, the empress's daughter, the 7th princess, was perched on a branch, brushing snow off the limbs, and throwing it at the crown prince beneath the tree. Her bell-like laughter accompanied the fine snow, as it fell softly from the tree. In a pavilion not far away, the empress, draped in a silver fox cloak, watched her laughing and playing children. Her eyes filled with smiles. Seeing this, my own eyes felt a bit stinging. Half a year ago, I was just like that, on the peach tree in our courtyard, picking the peaches one by one, and throwing them to my brother below. He would hold out the hem of his robe, running back and forth to catch them, getting so out of breath he could barely stand. Mother would stand nearby, smiling as she kneaded dough. By nightfall, we would have fragrant peach blossom cakes to eat. But my brother was quite the trickster. He always managed to sneak a few more than me. As I was thinking this, just as I was passing under the tree, I saw Situ Qingshu hiding nearby. I gave him a signal, and then he pulled back his slingshot, aiming at the branch beneath the princess. The branch shook, and with a startled scream, the little princess fell down. I saw my chance, threw the clothes aside, and rushed forward as fast as I ever had in my life, opening my arms wide. Situ Yanran was the same age as me. Only 7 years old then. How heavy could a 7-year-old child be? Well, heavy enough to break 2 of my ribs. After landing on me, she was stunned for a second, then burst into tears. Her pale-faced nanny rushed over, scooped her up, and ran toward the empress. The servants scrambled to check her for injuries. As the empress, her voice trembling, called for the imperial physician. No one noticed I was still lying in the snow. I lay on the ground, breaking out in a cold sweat from the pain, like a fish out of water, panting helplessly on the shore. The icy wind dried my tears. I felt as if I were about to die. Just then, a fair little face appeared in my blurred vision. Those bright eyes blinked and blinked, and against the gray sky, they shone like 2 little suns. Imperial mother, she is also hurt. Quickly, let the physician examine her too. Situ Changming's voice was very pleasant. Before I passed out from the pain, it occupied my entire consciousness. I don't have many qualities, but I have a very good memory. What others owe me, and what I owe others, I remember clearly even after 10 years. For instance, I remember Chen Pingan owes me a life, and I, in turn, owe Situ Changming a life. After my injuries healed, the empress kept me in Fingyi Palace. Fang Yueming had forged my background, so Eunuch Su, who served the empress, found nothing amiss. I understood why Fang Yueming wanted me to pretend to be a mute. A palace girl can be a clothes rack, or a fan, but she is anything but a person. Since I was meant to be overlooked, there was no need for me to speak. Or rather, it was better if I couldn't. Soon, the lantern festival arrived. The empress sat at the table with her 2 children. After I placed the glutinous rice balls on the table, the empress narrowed her almond eyes, gesturing toward me with her chin. I blinked, not understanding. Situ Yanran suddenly laughed. Chunlan is so silly. Imperial mother wants you to test for poison. Didn't the head maid teach you? When she said this, her 2 little legs swung back and forth under the table. On her gold-embroidered tiger head shoes, 2 red pom-poms danced and fluttered on her small toes. I remembered that I once had a pair of beautiful little shoes like those. Mother had made them for me to wear for the new year. But before I could even wear them, I didn't even have a home anymore. The rice balls were delicious, but a bit hot. So hot they rolled around in my mouth for several turns. A blister soon formed inside my mouth. Seeing my comical look, Situ Yenran clapped her hands and giggled, finally collapsing into the Empress's arms laughing. Actually, she wasn't bad at all. It was just that her innocence was sometimes cruel. At night, I was making Situ Changming's bed while nursing the blister on my lip. He pulled me aside, carefully applying mint ointment to my mouth. He leaned in so close that his eyes crossed, making him look hilarious. I couldn't help but laugh. He was a kind little crown prince, courteous to all the servants. Though clearly a mischievous 9-year-old, he could act like a little adult in front of his imperial father. In fact, except for the 1st and 15th of the month, the emperor rarely visited Fingyi Palace. On the night before his arrival, the usually good-tempered empress would take a ruler and force Situ Changming to study late into the night. Normally, the empress's smile was always clouded with a faint sorrow. Her eyes and smile would only light up the moment she saw the emperor. The emperor was not yet 30, tall and upright, with striking features, and his slightly pursed lips always held a trace of an indiscernible smile. His gaze lingered for a split second as it swept over me, but he quickly and naturally reached out to pick up the 2 children who ran laughing toward him. When the emperor stayed over at Fingyi Palace, the empress did not need my service. I enjoyed a rare moment of leisure. Late at night, clutching the cakes the empress had rewarded me with, I would sneak out to find Situ Qingshu. In the deep night on the corridor, our 2 small heads huddled together, stuffing pastries into our mouths, while whispering in muffled voices. Situ Qingshu's body was always covered in bruises of varying severity. Because he was the son of a disgraced consort, all the princes and princesses bullied him, and even the servants looked down on him. But he was used to playing the fool. No matter how they mocked or teased him, he only gave a silly grin and said nothing. Only in front of me would his eyes turn red. I would hold his head as his warm tears flowed into the crook of my neck. His long eyelashes were like little fans, sweeping against my neck over and over, making my heart feel itchy as well. Unfortunately, I couldn't stay long. I had to tell him about the empress's movements, so he could pass the message to Fan Yueming. Then I had to hurry back. 2 months later, I became even closer to Situ Changming and Situ Yenran. The 2 of them often brought me along to the prince's study. They sat in the front row, while Situ Qingshu sat in the very back. When the grand tutor lectured, Situ Qingshu would lower his head and close his eyes, pretending to doze off. Sometimes the grand tutor would deliberately call on him to answer, and he would act like he was just waking from a dream, wiping his drool, then blushing and scratching the back of his head, making everyone burst into laughter. They all said the once intelligent 4th prince had become a fool from excessive grief after his mother's death. I remembered his cold smile when he told me, "No one is wary of a fool." Situ Qingshu was pretending to be a fool, but Situ Changming seemed to really be a bit of a simpleton. He was always sneaking peeks at leisure books when the tutor wasn't looking, and he would even turn around to look at me, winking and mouthing words. I narrowed my eyes, struggling to read his lips. He said to go to Zhaoxing Tower after class. Zhaoxing Tower was the tallest building in the palace. From the top, one could overlook the entire capital. However, no one usually went up there. Situ Changming pulled me along, deftly shaking off the cluster of maids and eunuchs, and pulled out a key stolen from who knows where, to open Zhaoxing Tower. Panting, we climbed to the very top floor. Situ Changming opened his arms to the warm, gentle breeze. He gazed into the distance beyond the palace walls, the sunset making his little face glow. His eyes shone brighter than the jewels on his crown. At that moment, I thought, a boy this bright shouldn't be trapped within these palace walls. Situ Changming leaned half his body out between 2 railings, shouting excitedly at the sky. Suddenly his foot slipped, and he pitched forward. Subconsciously, I reached out my hand and grabbed him by the back of his collar. A cry of alarm escaped my lips. Careful! Just then, I felt as if someone behind me yanked me back, pulling both Situ Changming and me back to safety. But when I looked back, there was no one there. We were drenched in sweat from the fright, sitting on the floor with our bodies limp, gasping for air. After a while, Situ Changming suddenly looked at me in shock. "Chunlan, you can speak?" "Well, I never said. I was a mute." Seeing I couldn't hide it anymore, I just gave up and admitted it. He was stunned for a moment, then burst into laughter. "What? Are you going to tell the Empress?" "Why would I? You are my good friend. And besides, you saved me today. I would never betray a friend." He patted his chest, grinning to show his white teeth. I was slightly dazed. The Empress was my enemy, yet the enemy's son regarded me as a friend. Situ Changming looked at me curiously. "By the way, what was your name before you entered the palace?" I whispered 2 words, "Wan Qing." Situ Changming nodded with a smile. "Huh, that's a nice name. From now on, when no one is around, I'll call you Wan Qing, and you can call me Changming." After saying that, he spoke with a mysterious face. "Wan Qing, I know your secret, so I'll tell you one of mine too." He paused, leaning in to whisper in my ear, "I have a hidden guard. His name is Ajiao. He never leaves my side." My heart skipped a beat. It seemed the person who just yanked me back was that Ajiao. I asked him, did the emperor send him to protect you? Situ Changming shook his head. No. He is my uncle's man. After being a spy for several months, I had finally obtained a valuable clue. Grand Marshal Lu had planted hidden guards in the palace. Looking at his silly smiling face, I thought to myself, how old can such a foolish crown prince live to be? Time flew by, and Changming lived safely to the age of 15. Situ Yanran and I, one after the other, also passed our 13th birthdays. However, her birthday was a national celebration, while for mine, there were only the gifts from Situ Qingshu and Situ Changming. Changming's gift was in the courtyard of Fingyi Palace. He planted a peach tree for me. Relying on the taste in my memory, I made peach blossom cakes that summer. Everyone liked them very much. As I kneaded the dough and layered the pastry, I thought of my mother again. She was probably long gone from this world. Through the lonely years in the palace, my longing for her and my brother gradually overshadowed my resentment. Chen Pingon was so tough. Maybe he was still alive and well. I remembered a time when I accidentally missed a step and fell down the stairs. He hugged me and we rolled down together, and in the end, he served as my human cushion. After he pulled me up from the ground, he acted as if nothing had happened, dusted off his bottom, and ran away. I still remember his red birthmark, just like mine. Mine is under my collarbone, while his is on the back of his hand. If we ever meet again, I will surely recognize him at a glance. Over the past 5 or 6 years, following Fang Yueming's orders, I watched the Empress's every move, but I never found anything amiss. Even when the Empress met her father and brother, not a single redundant word was spoken. However, there was one time. I saw him hiding alone in the backyard woods, holding a thin branch, wielding it with precision and form, as if he were practicing swordplay. When he turned and saw me, he froze for a moment, his face flushing with a hint of embarrassment. I thought he would be angry, but he just walked over, and smilingly ruffled my hair. Later, when the Empress took Situ Changming and Situ Yanran to the Xinang Palace to pay their respects, she would take me along too. The Empress Dowager was a kind old lady, always wearing a gentle smile. Unfortunately, her health was poor, and she spent most of the year in bed. Changming and Yanran would gather around her, chatting and laughing lively. She would beckon me over too, and press a few golden melon seeds into my hand. The Empress Dowager's surname was also Lu. Was she also my enemy? The more I grew, the less I understood, only knowing that I couldn't bring myself to hate them. But one day, the Empress suddenly stopped liking me. It was a night with a full moon. It was late, but the Emperor had not yet arrived. Carrying dishes that had been reheated several times, I stepped into the Empress's sleeping quarters. The hall was brightly lit, yet it felt empty and somewhat desolate. The Empress sat alone before her dressing table. Her heavy pearl headdress worn all day, yet she refused to take it off. She just propped up her neck, staring absent-mindedly at her reflection in the mirror. Hearing footsteps, she turned back in pleasant surprise. But after seeing it was me, the light on her face instantly dimmed. I placed the food on the table, and knelt at her feet. Looking up at her, wrinkles had crept into the corners of her eyes. Even the perfect jewels couldn't hide the few premature white hairs at her temples. The Empress looked down at me, suddenly furrowing her brows, her pupils shrinking in shock. She murmured, "You. Why does this child look more and more like?" Before she could finish, she covered her mouth, then closed her eyes in pain. From then on, whenever the Emperor came to Fingyi Palace, she would send me away in advance. Actually, I could guess why. I was looking more and more like my late aunt. One night I went to find Qingshu, but he wasn't there. After a while, Fang Yueming walked in, stinking of alcohol. It was the first time I'd seen him so drunk. His gaze blurred, his face flushed. He staggered toward me, and I stumbled back. Finally, he pinned me into a corner, the heavy smell of wine blowing in my face. His trembling lips lingered a foot away from me, seeming to want to get closer, yet hesitantly pushing away. "Jilan, I miss you so much." His eyes welled with tears as he muttered nonsense. "Don't love Situ Xian, okay? He doesn't deserve it." He stared at me intently, grabbing my arm so hard it hurt. I knew my aunt's name was Chen Jilan, and Situ Xian was the emperor's name. Only then did I remember that today was the anniversary of my aunt's death. Just as I was at a loss for what to do, Qingshu returned. He froze on the spot in disbelief. The 14-year-old youth, like a master of the palace, was already nearly as tall as Fang Yueming. He rushed over, gritting his teeth, and with one kick sent Fang Yueming crashing to the ground. "You eunuch dog, how dare you touch even a hair on Wanqing?" Fang Yueming lay on the ground and began to laugh like a madman, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, do you hear? Your son, he calls me an eunuch dog. Situ Qingshu held the trembling me in his arms, leading me to the path where we first met. Under the moonlight, the youth's sharp-lined profile was exceptionally handsome. I lowered my head and hugged my knees, my voice muffled. "Situ Qingshu, do you think I look a lot like my aunt?" He stared at me blankly, then shook his head earnestly. "No, not at all. Wanqing is Wanqing." In his eyes, dark as ink, scattered starlight fell. My heart, which I thought had died when I was 7, began to throb wildly at that moment. The face of this youth. If I looked for another second, I would fall for him. I had to use both hands to cup my burning face, turning away to stop looking at him. The next day, Eunuch Su from the Empress's side somehow found a pile of incense ash and insisted Situ Qingshu had burned it. Holding private sacrifices in the palace was a grave crime. I didn't understand why the Lu family wanted to drive him to such a dead end. When Situ Changming and I rushed over, we saw Situ Qingshu crawling like a dog at the feet of the Empress and Eunuch Su. He cowed out humbly, repeatedly saying, "It is this son's fault." Situ Qingshu, he was also a prince, yet in front of everyone, he groveled and begged for mercy at a eunuch's feet. He clenched his jaw tight, his bloodshot eyes wide open, tears welling within. When his peripheral vision caught Situ Changming and me, the corner of his mouth twitched visibly. I knew that this undignified state was something he least wanted two people to see. One was me, and the other was Situ Changming. Situ Changming knelt before the Empress, pleading for Situ Qingshu. But the usually kind Empress now had a cold face, her brows tightly furrowed. Finally, Fang Yueming arrived with the Emperor. Fang Yueming, regarding Situ Qingshu, didn't seem to hold a grudge at all. On his expressionless face, there were no traces of last night's loss of composure. The Emperor glanced at Situ Qingshu on the ground, a fleeting look of disgust in his eyes. Situ Qingshu misses his birth mother. His sentiment is pitiable, yet his crime cannot go unpunished. As a small warning for a great offense, he shall be confined for 3 months. Having said that, he flicked his sleeves and left. The Empress also led the others away. Only Situ Qingshu was left prostrate on the ground. His voice, saying, "Thank you, Father, for your mercy," carried far in the bleak autumn wind. It felt like a rope winding around me, choking me until I couldn't breathe. Once Situ Qingshu began his confinement, it lasted until the end of the year. Having not seen him for nearly 3 months, my heart felt empty, as if I were the only one left in the world again. At that year's New Year's Eve feast, Situ Yanran had too much to drink and held my arm, talking all night long. "Wanqing, do you have someone you like?" She leaned in with a silly grin. My heart rate accelerated uncontrollably. But I still smiled and shook my head. "Hee, I do. His name is Ajo." I was stunned. The Grand Princess had actually fallen for a hidden guard. I hid the shock in my eyes without a trace, raised an eyebrow with a smile, and encouraged her to continue. "You haven't seen him. You wouldn't see him. But he is a very handsome and reliable person." Situ Yanran squinted with a tipsy expression, a deep blush rising on her cheeks. The usually boisterous girl was now smiling with an unusual shyness. She suddenly remembered something, opened her eyes wide, and pointed her finger at my nose. "Chunlan, you mustn't tell anyone, okay?" I tilted my head and looked at her with amusement. Only then did she seem to realize, laughing as if enlightened, and scratched her hair sheepishly. "Oh dear. I almost forgot you can't speak." This girl was still as annoying as she was when we were little. It was only later that I realized that at some unknown point, I had already come to treat her like my own sister. So I couldn't bear to tell her that reality was different from storybooks. Between a princess and a hidden guard, there was destined to be no future. Situ Changming, though a bit silly, was a good brother. Whatever Situ Yanran wanted, he would give her. For example, when she wanted to go to the Lantern Festival with Ajo, he readily agreed. The day of the spring night tour happened to be the day Situ Qingshu's confinement ended. I had intended to see him early, but I couldn't withstand Situ Changming's persistent begging, so I had to agree to accompany the siblings to the Lantern Festival before returning. Situ Yanran dressed up exquisitely, and finally left the house as the sun set. She wore a beautiful pink cloak. As she walked past Situ Changming, he stared blankly, his walk turning clumsy. Situ Yanran and I laughed until our stomachs ached. He scratched his head with a red face, then looked at me and swallowed. Luoyang during the spring night tour was bustling. Vendors were hawking all sorts of novelties. Girls from the western region swayed their waists, and various masks were a dizzying sight. The last time I visited the Lantern Festival was when I was 6, as a family of 4. Now, looking at the noisy prosperity, it felt surreal, like a lifetime ago. Situ Changming was still as agile as when he was a child, pulling me and Situ Yanran as he weaved through the crowd. Before long, he had shaken off the maids and eunuchs following us. Panting, we turned into a narrow alley. Situ Changming snapped his fingers, and a black figure landed silently under the eaves. "Ajo, I'll leave Situ Yanran to you." Situ Changming gave his sister a knowing smile. The youth in the shadows nodded. His face was half covered, his eyes dull yet ethereal, staring blankly at the girl beside him. Situ Yanran's face turned red. She lowered her head and grabbed the youth's sleeve, heading toward the crowded throng, disappearing in a moment. Situ Changming and I chatted casually. As the crowd pushed us forward, the flow of people around us grew thicker, pressing the two of us tightly together. His gaze toward me became evasive. "Young master, why not buy a rabbit lantern for the young lady?" A vendor held up a lantern, approaching with a face full of smiles. Just as Situ Changming was about to pay, I stopped him and shook my head. I pointed to a tiger head lantern hanging on a stall across the street and said to him, I want that one. Looking at that cute, clumsy little tiger from afar, my eyes began to sting. I remembered the spring night tour 7 years ago. My brother and I both took a fancy to such a tiger head lantern, but in the end, the last remaining one went to him. My parents bought me 2 rabbit lanterns as compensation. But I cried and threw them on the ground, stomping them into pieces. Situ Changming turned his face to look at me in confusion. Wanqing likes the tiger head lanterns that boys play with? I kept a straight face, extending my arm rigidly, becoming as stubborn as I was when I was little. That one. He humored me. Alright, I'll buy it for you. He then pulled me through the crowded masses, through the swaying lantern light, and through 7 long years of time, finally presenting that tiger head lantern before me. When I held it in my hand, I wasn't as happy as I had imagined, because I discovered that the lantern actually wasn't expensive at all, nor was it any prettier than a rabbit lantern. I think back then, what I wanted was just more of my parents' favoritism. Now, I haven't had parents for a long time. Situ Changming sat with me at a roadside stall eating glutinous rice balls. He blew on each one to cool it before feeding it to me. Though not as delicious as those in the palace, at least they wouldn't cause blisters from the heat. Suddenly, I caught sight of a street corner not far away. A woman was there with her 2 children, kneeling there pitiably. The girl's face was sallow, and there was a straw tag stuck in her hair. For some reason, my heart felt as if it were suddenly gripped tight. I pointed at the woman and said stutteringly, Situ Changming, look, someone is selling their daughter over there. To support her son. She's going to sell her daughter. I stood up, pulling his arm in desperate haste. Let's go quickly. Quick, give her money, don't let her sell her daughter. Seeing me like this, Situ Changming was somewhat startled, yet he submissively allowed me to pull him along. Though the distance was only half a street, it seemed so far away. I was terrified that someone would take the girl away in the next second, leaving her mother forever. Situ Changming emptied every last bit of money he had on him, repeatedly urging the woman never to sell her daughter again. She cowed out for a long time in gratitude, then pulled her 2 thin children, and hurried away. Long after they had left, I remained standing there with a face full of tears. Situ Changming didn't say a word, he only held my cold hand tightly. We had no money left to hire a carriage, so we had to walk back. We didn't speak the whole way. When we passed the Xuanwu Gate, splendid fireworks exploded across the night sky. Amidst the deafening sounds, Situ Changming leaned into my ear and shouted, Wanqing, make a wish. In the past, I might have wanted revenge, wanted Situ Qingshu to become the crown prince, or even wanted time to turn back 7 years. But now, I felt that none of that was important anymore. As the fireworks fell, I pressed my hands together, looked at the sky and said, may the country be rich and strong, and the world be at peace. May no mother ever be forced to choose between her children. Alright, no problem. Leave it to this crown prince. I looked at him with a bit of amusement. Don't you always say you want to be a free and idle man, and don't want to be the crown prince? Isn't it because I'm afraid I won't do a good job? He scratched his head sheepishly. To be a wise ruler, knowledge alone isn't enough. One must also master statecraft. In this regard, I seem unable to learn, in this aspect. Situ Qingshu is probably truly better than him. You can definitely do it. I smiled and patted his shoulder. I'll leave the common folk of Great Zhou to you. The sky full of fireworks reflected in his eyes, stirring a barely visible ripple. He looked at me solemnly, and nodded vigorously. By the time we returned to the palace, Situ Yanran had already returned. Situ Changming let me slip away quietly, while he went before the empress to receive his punishment. Before I could even put down the tiger head lantern, I ran in a frantic hurry to find Situ Qingshu. I pushed open the door, and saw him sitting alone in the courtyard. On the table were 2 bowls of glutinous rice balls, long since cold. In his hands, he held a crudely made rabbit lantern. Looking at that rabbit lantern, I wanted to laugh a little. The frame was twisted and crooked, barely resembling the shape of a rabbit. Situ Qingshu looked up and saw me, suddenly standing up, looking at me with a smile. But when he saw the tiger head lantern in my hand, the light in his eyes instantly vanished. Wanqing, you went out to see the lanterns? I looked at the bloodstains on his palms from the bamboo splinters, and nodded guiltily. Was it with Situ Changming? His eyes suddenly reddened, his fists clenching until they cracked. I opened my mouth but didn't know what to say. He looked up, took a deep breath, slammed the rabbit lantern in his hand onto the ground, and then stomped on it with force. Without a word, he turned and walked into the house, slamming the door shut. I stood there in a daze for a long time, before silently walking over, and slowly crouching down. The little rabbit he had made with his own hands lay on the ground, smashed to pieces by his stomp. It looked back at me with its red eyes, a bit ridiculous yet a bit pitiable. What did the little rabbit do wrong? When I was little, I stomped them into pieces, and now Situ Qingshu had stomped this one into pieces too. With tears streaming down my face, I picked it up piece by piece and put it in my robe, as if picking up my childhood self. I didn't want revenge anymore, at least not against the empress. Even after realizing I looked like the former concubine Qin, she had never mistreated me. After all, how bad could a mother, who raised such sweet and naive children, really be? If I were to seek revenge, it should be against Prime Minister Liu and his ilk, but that was beyond my capabilities. However, Fan Yueming didn't think so. He thought I should go a step further. He stared at me with a half-smile. The girl has grown up. It's a pity for such a beauty to be a maid. Why not become a concubine for the crown prince? By moving to the East Palace with him at the end of the year, you can obtain more intelligence. I knelt on the ground, biting my lip in distress. Your lordship, I'm afraid I don't have that kind of ability. How will you know if you don't try? Must I teach you how to seduce a man? He leaned in and squeezed my chin, forcing me to meet his gaze. But after a moment, he was the first to look away. A flash of loneliness in his eyes. Then he let go and flicked his sleeves, departing. Just as Fan Yueming left, Situ Qingshu pushed open the door and entered. I knew he had just been eavesdropping outside. Ever since Fan Yueming acted drunkenly toward me, Situ Qingshu never let me be alone with him. Can you please not go? He kept his face tense and his head down, not looking. Maybe I can help you this way. I don't want you to help me like this. His voice was emotional, his eyes slightly red. He spread his arms and hugged me tightly. Wan Jing, I can't live without you. Situ Changming is the crown prince. He has everything. But I only have you. I beg of you. Don't go, alright? Watching his tears fall uncontrollably, I was stunned. Over all these years, though he had no dignity before outsiders, I knew that deep down, he was an extremely proud person. Such a proud second prince, was now weeping and begging me humbly. My heart ached so much I couldn't breathe. In a moment of heat, I stood on my tiptoes, held his shoulders, and pressed my lips to his. His whole body trembled violently. He froze for a moment, then reached out to clasp my waist, leaning down to return the kiss. His burning breath sent a shiver through my entire body. I could only struggle to use my last bit of reason to break free from his embrace. Walking on the path where we first met, I made a decision. I wanted to leave Fingyi Palace. I didn't want to lie to the Empress and Situ Changming anymore, and even less did I want to make Situ Qingshu sad. Revenge, that was between Fan Yueming and the Emperor. I didn't want to be used as a pawn anymore. Committing more wrongs. For responsibilities I couldn't bear, I must find a way to provoke the Empress. To make her send me away. For ordinary trifles. If Situ Changming pleads for me, she surely won't punish me. So, I had to cross her absolute bottom line. One summer afternoon, the heat was enough to make one faint. Wearing a thin gauze robe, I knelt beside Situ Changming, fanning him. In the past, he never let me do such things, fearing I would get tired. But today, might be the last time I ever fan him. Situ Changming was sound asleep in his rocking chair, a book on political strategy resting on his chest. Since that night of the spring night tour, he had indeed become much more diligent over the past 6 months. Even the Grand Tutor, who was usually dissatisfied with him, praised his rapid progress. I rested my chin on my hand, watching his peaceful sleeping face, and a sudden sense of reluctance welled up in my heart. Once he marries the crown princess at the end of the year and moves to the East Palace, it will be difficult to see him again. The Empress would come every day at the third quarter of the way hour to check on Situ Changming's schoolwork. By now, she should be almost at the door. Timing it perfectly, I took a deep breath and leaned over, gently pressing a kiss onto Situ Changming's face. The Empress hates nothing more than maids seducing the crown prince, especially me, since I possess a face that bears a 70% resemblance to the woman she loathed most. But before the Empress could enter and catch us, Situ Changming unexpectedly woke up early. He rubbed his eyes groggily, touched his face, and tilted his head, smiling at me in confusion. The situation had exceeded my expectations, but I already heard the sound of the Empress approaching. I had no choice but to steel my resolve, grit my teeth, and lean in again, planting another kiss on Situ Changming's cheek. His face turned beet red instantly, and his eyes went wide with shock. He stammered as he asked, Do you like me? I didn't want to lie to him, so I could only lower my head in silence. Wan Qing, would you be willing to be my crown princess? I looked up in shock. I used to think he was just a bit naive, but now it seemed he had gone completely mad. Seeing my silence, he actually grew bolder and reached out, cupping my face as he leaned in for a sighing kiss. The moment I felt his soft lips, I wanted to slap myself in regret. There were other ways to get the Empress to expel me, so why on earth did I come up with such a terrible idea that would hurt? Situ Changming? The Empress finally burst through the door in a rage, grabbed me by the wrist, and shoved me to the ground. Her palm was raised high, but it hesitated to fall. She turned her face away, refusing to look at me, and only squeezed a single word from her throat. Go. I retreated from the room as quickly as I could. Situ Changming was still frozen in place. As I closed the door, I heard him shouting something at the top of his lungs. My heart was wrenched violently, but I walked away without looking back. At least from now on, I would never have to lie to him again. I returned to the laundry bureau. Fan Yueming knew I had been kicked out of Fingyi Palace. He only offered a few simple rebukes. Instead of the explosive fury I had expected, over the years I had come to understand his temperament. When it came to me and Situ Qingshu, his bark was always worse than his bite. In truth, I knew that I was no longer of much use to him. 7 years ago, his power couldn't even match that of eunuch Su by the empress's side. But now, more than half the eunuchs in the palace belonged to him and the emperor. Upon my return to the laundry bureau, Situ Qingshu was the most delighted. He stopped going to the academy altogether, coming to help me wash clothes every single day. He claimed he was protecting me, fearing the empress would make things difficult for me. He would spread a book across his knees and occasionally lend me a hand. I washed, he wrung out the water. We actually worked together quite well. The maids in the laundry bureau would avoid him when they saw him, pointing and whispering behind his back, but he didn't care. I swung the wooden paddle against the washboard, splashing droplets of water onto my face. While I wasn't paying attention, Situ Qingshu leaned over and quickly stole a kiss on my cheek. I turned to playfully swat him with a smile, and he just blushed, pretending to look down at his book. But my smile completely froze the moment I looked up. I saw Situ Changming standing at the entrance, staring at us blankly, like a shadow puppet with its strings cut. His arms hung limply at his sides. His face was pale and his eyes were hollow, his lips trembling slightly. There was even a large, bloody wound on his forehead. Situ Qingshu saw him too, stood up abruptly, and stepped forward to shield me. I lowered my head, my heart pounding wildly. I wanted to explain to Situ Changming, but I didn't know where to begin. Should I say I was Fan Yueming's spy? Or that I was a remnant of concubine Chen's past? Even our very first meeting had been meticulously planned. I closed my eyes in agony. When I opened them again, Situ Changming was already gone. I didn't know then that I had already lost forever the chance to apologize to him. When the end of the year arrived, Situ Changming was married. The crown princess, unsurprisingly, was surnamed Lu, the legitimate daughter of the commander, his own cousin. With the crown prince's wedding, combined with New Year's Eve and the spring night tour, the palace was festive for nearly a month. The laundry piled up into a mountain. Situ Qingshu held my hand with heartache, which was covered in chilblains. Looking at me with burning intensity, he said, "Wan Qing, just wait a little longer. When I become the crown prince, you will be the crown princess. I will definitely give you a wedding even grander than this one." I only gave a faint smile and said nothing. I never cared about such things. If Situ Qingshu really became the crown prince, what would happen to Situ Changming? I didn't dare to think about it. After Situ Changming's wedding, he moved to the East Palace. Situ Yenran, having lost her brother's company, frequently came over to talk to me. Tugging my sleeve with teary eyes, she said, "Chunlan, I can never see Ajo again." Just after the first lunar month, a decree came from Sinang Palace, specifically summoning me to serve the Empress Dowager. This was quite unexpected. I didn't think Her Majesty would still remember me. The Empress Dowager was as kind as ever, but her illness had grown increasingly severe. Sometimes she even had incontinence. When I wiped her body for her, she would always give me an apologetic smile. "Good child. I'm troubling you." The Empress Dowager drank more medicine than she ate food daily, out of habit. Before feeding her the medicine, I would take a sip first to test for poison, but she stopped me. That's not good for a young girl's health. Testing with a silver needle is enough. No one dares to plot against me. Her eyes crinkled in a smile, and on her wrinkled face, a playful, youthful expression actually appeared. The Empress Dowager was cheerful all day long, never losing her temper at the servants. Even when the pain made her face pale with suffering, she would only let out a few soft groans. She really liked the peach blossom cakes I made, though it was a pity she couldn't eat much due to her poor digestion. In the spring of the second month, the crown prince and crown princess came to pay their respects. Having not seen him for over half a year, Situ Changming had grown taller and much more composed. It was as if he were a different person. He performed his bows and replied to questions with perfect decorum. When the Empress Dowager wasn't questioning him, he kept his lips tight, staring at the floor without expression. One must remember that when he used to visit, he was like a magpie, chirping away with endless things to say. I stood by the Empress Dowager's bedside, and he acted as if he didn't even see me, not casting a single glance my way. On the contrary, it was the crown princess who looked at me from time to time. She was a charming and lovely young girl, with features that were 50% similar to the Empress. She spoke beautifully, keeping the Empress Dowager amused and smiling. When they were leaving, I escorted them out. The crown princess suddenly touched her hairline and said, "Brother Changming, I think I've lost the hairpin the Empress rewarded me with." She glanced at me, took Situ Changming's arm, and said softly, "I'll go look for it with Sister Chunlan. You go on back first." Situ Changming nodded and smiled at her, tenderly reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind her ear. For some reason, my heart felt a faint, stinging pain. But the next second, I felt a sense of relief. He is the crown prince, after all. He was simply played by a reckless girl, that's all. It's like being bitten by a dog. It hurts for a day or two, and then you forget it. The crown princess is his direct cousin, and is so adorable. How could she not be better than me? Seeing him happy, the guilt in my heart seemed to lessen slightly. But when the crown princess led me to the edge of a dried up well, I began to worry for him again. It was you, this lowly servant, who seduced my brother Changming, wasn't it? She dropped her gentle mask and slapped me across the face. I couldn't help but laugh. The women of the Lu family are truly getting worse with each generation. Flushed with rage, she ordered the old maidservant beside her to pin my arms from behind. Then she tossed her hairpin into the well. Sister Chunlan, please trouble yourself to go down the well and retrieve my pin. She grabbed the back of my neck with force, pressing me against the well's edge. I struggled desperately, but it was to no avail. Facing the deep, dark bottom of the well, I closed my eyes. Just then, the old maidservant behind me cried out and released her grip. A dark figure descended swiftly, and a strike landed on my neck. The world went dark, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up again, I was lying in Sinang Palace. The Empress Dowager had rarely left her bed, but she sat beside me, tenderly touching my feverish forehead. Good child, don't be afraid. I was dazed with fever. In my haze, I seemed to see my mother smiling at me. As a child, only on the days I was sick did my mother belong solely to me. Even my brother had to follow my every command. I tried my best to snuggle closer to the Empress Dowager, smelling her faint fragrance. My nose stung, and tears began to flow uncontrollably. Before that summer ended, several major events occurred in the palace. First, Prime Minister Lu suddenly suffered a stroke. He didn't attend court for several consecutive months. Beneath the surface of the court, undercurrents were surging. The emperor sequentially dismissed several of the Lu family's partisans and installed his own confidants. Fang Yueming remained as stern as ever, but I could still see in his eyes a hint of joy he couldn't quite hide. Without Prime Minister Lu's interference, Situ Qingshu was finally granted a title, and began to secretly cultivate ties with scholars from humble backgrounds. On the day he moved out of the palace, he held me tightly in his arms and whispered in my ear, Wanqing, just wait a little longer, it's almost time. I clearly should have been happy for him, but my heart felt heavy. If that day really comes, what will happen to Situ Changming? What about Situ Yenran, the Empress, and the Empress Dowager? If Situ Qingshu knew that I was worrying about these enemies, he would surely be angry with me. The second event was Situ Yenran's coming-of-age ceremony. But on that very same day, the marriage decree was also issued. The husband-to-be was the most highly regarded rising star in the emperor's eyes in recent years. Despite his youth, he had achieved the highest rank in the exams. This was something the empress had pleaded for by kneeling before the emperor 3 times. It wasn't for Situ Yenran, but for Situ Changming. Now that Prime Minister Lu was ill, the once all-powerful Prime Minister's matter had to rely on the first princess to court the new elite. Situ Yenran came to find me. Chunlan. Mother says as long as I marry him, he can be used by my brother. Situ Yenran forced a smile and raised her face, blinking her eyes to keep her tears from falling. Is it true that no matter how favored a daughter is, she is only fit to pave the way for the son? I nodded with a bitter smile. I had known that for a very long time. She lowered her head and sighed, wiping her eyes, not saying a single word about her Ajo. The third event was that Prince Huai had fallen ill, and it was quite serious. Half the imperial physicians were around the Empress Dowager, and the other half went to the Lu Manor. Not a single one went to Prince Huai's manor. Prince Huai was the emperor's younger brother, and the son the Empress Dowager had once loved most. Years ago, the late emperor originally wanted to name Prince Huai as crown prince, but the current emperor, then Prince Jing, had won the favor of Prime Minister Lu. The only legitimate daughter of the Lu family was determined to marry him. With the Lu family's support, he finally ascended the throne. Immediately after his coronation, he placed Prince Huai under house arrest. Because of this, there had always been a rift between him and the Empress Dowager. From the day she heard Prince Huai was gravely ill, the Empress Dowager refused to take her medicine. The emperor finally came. He took the medicine bowl from my hand and sat by the Empress Dowager's bedside. Mother, are you throwing a tantrum with your son? His voice was very calm. Swear. Mother begs you to save your brother. This was the first time I had seen the Empress Dowager so humble, pleading for one son to another. This mother and son, this brotherhood, felt somewhat ridiculous. It's not the first time the third brother has faked an illness. Why must mother worry? The Empress Dowager held the emperor's hand. In the past, mother failed you. But he is your own brother. The emperor stood up abruptly, a hint of mockery on his face. He held the medicine bowl out to the Empress Dowager. Fine, mother. This bowl contains deadly poison. If you dare to drink it, I will immediately send imperial physicians to see him. I looked up in shock, wanting to snatch the medicine bowl away, but my body felt paralyzed, unable to move. I watched as the Empress Dowager took the poison without hesitation and drank it all in one gulp. The next second, the emperor snatched the empty bowl and smashed it on the ground. Shards of porcelain flew up and cut my face. Yet I felt no pain. He threw his head back and laughed aloud, his eyes bloodshot. Mother, you love him that much? Mother, didn't you say that for the Lu family's honor? One must live on no matter how pathetic life becomes? Now, for him, You don't even care about the Lu family's glory and wealth? The Empress Dowager was not poisoned. She only leaned against the bedpost, trembling all over, weeping with her eyes closed. The Emperor knelt on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Mother, I am also your son. Why don't you say something? But the Empress Dowager only gathered her strength, pressed her lips together, and didn't speak a word. This standoff lasted for who knows how long. When I regained my senses, the Emperor had already left. I couldn't stop shaking. I crawled to the Empress Dowager's side, and hugged her legs tightly. But she acted as if nothing had happened, gently stroking my hair. Good child, I scared you, didn't I? Fang Yueming gave me the best scar cream. By the beginning of autumn, the scar on my face had faded until it was barely visible. On the day of the Mid-Autumn Festival, Situ Yenran was married off. The 10-mile red bridal procession covered the entire Imperial Road. The little girl I had grown up with was so beautiful today that I almost didn't recognize her. Situ Changming rode a horse, leading the bridal party at the very front. His head was bowed, his expression unreadable. I wondered if Ajio was there, and if he had seen his little princess at her most beautiful. I had nothing to give her, so I could only tuck a box of peach blossom cakes into her arms. She took off the amulet she had worn since childhood, and placed it in my palm. With a choked voice, she said, Junlan, when you leave the palace, you must marry the one you love. She didn't know I already had someone in my heart, but I seemed to be drifting further and further away from him. Autumn in Luoyang is very short. It felt as if all the leaves fell in a single night. When the news of Prince Huai's death reached Sinang Palace, I was carrying a bowl of freshly brewed medicine. The Empress Dowager only let out a deep sigh. After taking the bowl from my hand, she asked me to get a peach blossom cake. I turned around with the plate, only to see her snap the silver needle into 2 pieces. Her fingers forcefully crushed half of it, sprinkling it into the medicine before drinking it all. Then she spoke. Wanqing, that is your name, right? She smiled at me with narrowed eyes. The plate in my hand fell to the floor. She looked at me gently. Don't be afraid. No one knows your secret except me and the Emperor. Your aunt was a good child. And so are you. It must have been hard pretending to be mute all these years. She beckoned to me. My eyes reddened, and I threw myself into her arms. She gently stroked my head. Wanqing, do you know why the Emperor hates me so much? When he was little, I hadn't become the Empress yet. I made him suffer a lot to compete for favor. But later, when I wanted to make amends, it was already too late. I looked at her, my face covered in tears. Good child, you still resent your mother, don't you? But do you know? A mother is willing to give her life for any of her children. It's just that sometimes, there really is no choice. Of course, I'm not asking you to forgive her. No one in this world has the right to make you forgive her. I just want you to know that she loved you. I raised my tear-filled eyes, only to see her face turn a sallow gold, and she suddenly coughed up a mouthful of black blood. It was then that I finally understood. The silver needle used to test for poison every day was itself poisonous. That was the reason she had been bedridden. And she had always been fully aware of her own son's arrangements. Empress Dowager, I'll find the physician. I'll find the Emperor. In my panic, I tried to stand up. She grabbed me and shook her head with difficulty. He killed his brother. I don't want to see him. Neither of them needs me anymore. I finally don't have to live anymore. She smiled, and closed her eyes wearily. The hand clutching my sleeve fell away limply. Who knows how much time passed? The son she didn't want to see arrived after all. The Emperor looked at the Empress Dowager's lifeless face in terror, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her violently. Mother, I already sent the Imperial physician to see Situan. I really didn't kill him. Mother, I won't make you angry ever again. Wake up and look at me. He lay across his mother's cooling body, crying like an abandoned child. But what use was it? She could no longer hear him. Not every misunderstanding has a day of resolution. Just as not every mistake can be forgiven. On the day the Empress Dowager passed away, Prime Minister Lu also breathed his last. In Luoyang, at the beginning of winter, 2 long funeral processions met at Xuanwu Gate. A sister and brother for most of their lives, they finally met again on the road to the Yellow Springs. I looked up at the snowflakes drifting through the sky, and remembered the peach blossom tree at home. Whenever the peach blossoms fell, my brother would stand in the rain of flowers and smile at me. Chen Pingon, where are you now? Do you still remember losing my bamboo dragonfly? You said you were just borrowing it to play, but in the end, you never gave it back to me. Sigh, if you really can't find it, then forget it. You don't have to hide from me because of that. I don't even blame you anymore. When will you finally come and find me? The Emperor kept me in Sinang Palace. He made me repeat the Empress Dowager's final words over and over again late into the night. But during the day, he sat in the imperial court with an expressionless face, purging the Lu family's protégés and allies. Once Prime Minister Lu died, the Lu family lost its backbone. There was nothing left for him to fear. Only then did I understand that the Empress Dowager's lingering survival all those years was not just to preserve the Lu family's wealth and glory, but even more to protect her son. She waited for his wings to grow sharp for him to plan every step, waiting until the Lu family was on the verge of collapse. The New Year's Eve feast that year was exceptionally lonely. Not even fireworks were set off. Situ Qingshu no longer sat in the back. He had moved to the second seat, on the emperor's right-hand side. From time to time, he looked over at me, with an expression on his face that I couldn't decipher. Fang Yueming stood solemnly behind the emperor, lost in thought. Anxiety suddenly spread through my heart. The hand I held the wine flagon with began to tremble slightly. After 3 rounds of drinks, the sound of clashing weapons suddenly came from outside the hall. A gust of wind violently pushed open the hall doors. A strong, cold wind carrying snow rushed into the hall. I saw dozens of imperial guards outside, besieging 3 figures dressed in black. The empress and her 2 children looked up almost simultaneously, their faces turning pale in an instant. I recognized Aegyo by those ethereal yet dull eyes. His movements were as swift as a ghost, weaving through the flash of blades. The other 2 black-clad figures had already been captured alive, only he was still stubbornly holding out. But moments later, he was outnumbered. He was gradually suppressed by the shrinking circle of guards. Blood splattered from his right arm, staining the snow. A piercing red. Aegyo! Situ Yanran cried out as if losing her soul. She stood up straight, under the watchful eyes of the crowd, and before the stunned eyes of her husband. The young woman climbed over the table and ran toward the outside of the hall. She rushed into the heavy snow like a madwoman, running toward the wounded youth in black. The imperial guards, seeing her looking so frenzied, all stepped aside. She ran until her hair was disheveled, losing all the dignity of a princess, but she finally stood by his side. She snatched the blade from Aegyo's hand, and held it against her own neck. "Let him go, father. Your daughter begs you." She collapsed to her knees, screaming the same words over and over with a hoarse voice. The emperor let out a long sigh. Finally, he closed his eyes and waved his hand. The imperial guards broke their encirclement. Aegyo did not move. "Go, quick." Situ Yanran pushed him hard. After a moment of hesitation, Aegyo turned and leaped, jumping onto the eaves, and vanished into the falling snow. Lu Tongling keeping private guards in the palace was a crime equivalent to rebellion. The first secret Situ Changming had told me, when we were young, finally made him lose everything on this day. The decrees to depose the empress and the crown prince came on the same day. The mother and son were imprisoned in the forbidden courtyard. Situ Yanran was also stripped of her title as princess, and placed under house arrest in the consort's estate. Lu Tongling was not sentenced to death. It was only exile. That was the last bit of dignity the emperor left for the Lu family. On that year's spring lantern night, there was no lantern festival. The Lu family had fallen. The family feud was avenged, but I didn't feel happy at all. Situ Qingshu, however, was in a good mood. He asked Luoan to bring me a rabbit lantern. The palace craftsmanship was so beautiful it was flawless. But I preferred the ugly rabbit he had made for me by hand that year. The emperor got drunk. He pulled my hand just like Fang Yueming used to, looking at me with teary eyes. "Jilan, I didn't mean to cause Situan's death. I didn't want you and your brother to die either. But I really had no other way." I looked at him with amusement. A man in his 30s, crying like a child before falling asleep. I struggled to withdraw my hand, which he had gripped until it was red. I walked out of the hall, and sat on the cold steps. I hugged my arms and sniffed, looking up at the moon that was just as round as when I was a child. I remembered many years ago. Mother had one arm around me, and the other around my brother, telling us stories in the courtyard. After a while, my brother's mind wandered, and he crawled on the grass to catch crickets. I lay on mother's lap alone. The way she looked at me was even gentler than the moon in the sky. "So, mother, when you sent me onto that prisoner carriage, you really had no choice either, right?" Spring arrived. The imperial garden was filled with clusters of flowers. It was as if everything that happened in winter had never occurred. The crown prince had been deposed for 3 months, but the emperor had not appointed a new one. Lu Tongling claimed to be gravely ill and had been delaying his departure for Liuzhou. The usually steady Fang Yueming was starting to get restless. He brought the matter up several times through subtle hints, but the emperor always changed the subject. It was true. Situ Qingshu was not the only older prince, but he was the only one who had a grudge against the emperor. In June, the sweltering heat made one dizzy. Lu Tongling's illness had not yet improved, but the emperor fell ill instead. Situ Qingshu finally stopped acting foolish. Like the 3rd and 4th princes, he often came to the imperial study. But no matter how exquisite his acting was, in the end, it couldn't compare to the sincere affection shown by his 2 younger brothers. When I was seeing him out of the study, he grabbed my sleeve and said in a low voice, "Father, he didn't do anything to you, did he?" I was stunned for a moment, finally understanding what he meant. Then I shook my head. He let out a sigh of relief. Lowering his voice, he whispered in my ear, "Protect yourself in 3 days." Those words chilled me from the top of my head to the soles of my feet. Just as I was about to ask further, he had already hurried away. After half a month of stifling heat, it finally turned into rolling thunder. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, amidst the dull thunder, the sounds of clashing blades and shouting faintly arrived. A little eunuch came running in, stumbling and crawling, reporting that Lu Tongling was leading the army. and was marching toward the palace. The emperor lay on the rocking chair with his eyes half closed, merely waving his hand. Calm as if he had expected it all along. Rest easy, I have already arranged for the imperial guards. They won't get through Xuanwu Gate. An hour later, the sounds of slaughter and the cries of palace staff drew closer and closer. His expression finally changed. Fan Yueming, get Fan Yueming here. He stood up abruptly from the rocking chair and paced forward irritably. The moment the door opened, a flash of bright lightning tore through the sky. The steps outside the door were covered with the corpses of palace maids and eunuchs. Fan Yueming stood outside with a sword, looking like a ghost. Her eyes were blood red. As she stepped over the corpses, approaching step by step, she shouted loudly. Lu Tongling is leading the army to storm the palace. When your servant arrived to protect the emperor, His Majesty had unfortunately already been slain by the rebels. Fan Yueming, with a blank expression, recited the script she had already written, slowly raising the sword in her hand. The emperor's eyes widened in horror, looking at his longtime confidant with utter disbelief. Fan Yueming, after more than 20 years of friendship, you actually betrayed me? Fan Yueming let out a cold snort. Situ Xian, from the day you caused Jilan's death, there has been no friendship left between us. Another flash of lightning struck, illuminating the dim hall in a deathly white. I huddled in the corner, watching it all for my aunt whom I never met, watching how this grievance would be resolved. After the brief brightness, the hall fell into darkness again. A figure suddenly flashed in rapidly. The sound of clashing swords echoed throughout the hall. I saw a woman with disheveled clothes leap forward to block the path in front of the emperor. It was the empress. She bit her lip. Her face was sallow, but her eyes were shining brightly. The emperor softly called out, "Aro." The empress turned her head toward the emperor and smiled tenderly. "Xian, don't be afraid." Those two voices held a tenderness I had never heard before. Across 20 years of time, they called to each other. They were no longer the nameless emperor and empress, but Xian and Aro. Just like Situ Qingshu and I were cousins, the closest of kin. The empress turned her wrist and raised her sword to strike at Fan Yueming. The way she swung her sword reminded me of a day many years ago, when I saw her swinging a tree branch behind the bushes. In each move and strike, the chilling light of the blade traveled rapidly through the hall. Situ Xian recovered from his moment of shock, turned back to the desk, and threw the inkstone at Fan Yueming. Suddenly, a sharp arrow flew through the air, striking Situ Xian squarely in the chest. The inkstone fell heavily to the floor. He tightened his brows in pain, his pupils dilating from extreme shock. Following his line of sight, I saw Situ Qingshu standing outside the door, pulling back his bowstring from the side. The heavy rain fell like beads. The youth in the rain was soaked through. I couldn't see his expression clearly, but I could clearly see those eyes full of resentment. The empress gave a short cry, dropped the sword in her hand, and caught Situ Xian's falling body. In the next moment, Fan Yueming had already raised her sword and thrust it into her back. Blood ran down the blade, and a heavy scent of blood began to spread through the hall. I stood up shakily, leaning against the wall, walking toward the pair of lovers embracing in a pool of blood. My vision began to spin and blur. Before I lost consciousness, youthful friendship eventually couldn't withstand the whims of the world. Situ Qingshu, let's not start such a cycle again, okay? When I opened my eyes again, it was already 10 days later. An unfamiliar maid said I had been in a deep sleep for 10 days with a high fever. Situ Qingshu had moved the entire Imperial Medical Academy to my side. Another unfamiliar eunuch told me that Lu Tongling had rebelled, and the Lu clan's 9 generations had been exterminated. The late emperor was killed by rebels. Before he died, he passed the throne to the second prince who came to the rescue. The deputy general of the Imperial Guard, having distinguished himself in protecting the emperor, was promoted to commander. I quickly figured out the key details. Situ Qingshu had won over General Hu in advance, letting him pretend to be Lu Tongling's inside man, opening the palace gates to let the rebels in before surrounding them. Then, in the name of the rebels, he seized the throne. But General Hu was the late emperor's confidant. I didn't understand what kind of leverage could make him betray the kindness he had been shown. On the day the new emperor ascended the throne, I got my answer. The coronation ceremony and the investiture of the empress were held on the same day. Situ Qingshu's empress was General Hu's daughter. Later, Situ Qingshu found me. Wanqing, give me another year. I still need that man named Hu right now. Wanqing, let's make you the noble consort first, okay? I really have no choice right now. I found that he was becoming more and more like the father he had killed. Even the things he said were the same. I shook my head. Situ Qingshu, look at the late emperor and the late empress, they were also cousins. But how did they end up? As long as you don't marry me, I will always be your cousin. Your closest relative. Isn't that good? I looked up tiredly and smiled at him, but met his sinister gaze. Is it because of Situ Changming? His words hit me like a heavy hammer to the head. I suddenly realized that I had forgotten the most important thing. Where are Situ Changming and Situ Yanran? What did you do to them? I stumbled and fell from the bed, cold sweat instantly soaking my back, my breathing becoming rapid. What's the point of keeping people from that family? He stared at me intently, each word sounding like a wicked curse. I struggled to crawl up from the floor, and raised my hand to slap him across the face. He looked at me with a mix of shock and anger, tore off the imperial crown from his head, and pushed me fiercely onto the bed. Just like when we fought as children, he held my wrists firmly. I looked directly at him without flinching. I watched his face turn red, and the anger in his eyes slowly turned into a thick desire. The moment he leaned down, I turned my head to the side. His hot lips fell on my earlobe. He stiffened for a moment, then buried his head in the crook of my neck. His heavy breathing turned into a sob a moment later. "He's not dead. Are you satisfied?" His raspy voice sounded in my ear. He looked up with red eyes, glanced at me blankly, then got up and left the bed, pushing the door open to continue his performance. I began to laugh loudly, laughing until my chest felt bursts of sharp pain. That night, Fan Yueming came to see me. She said she had hidden Situ Changming in a place no one knew about. As long as Situ Changming lived, Situ Qingshu would have to follow her orders. Otherwise, she could let the throne slip away at any time, except for Situ Changming. The fates of everyone else were decided by Situ Qingshu, the Empress's confidant, Eunuch Su. The eunuch who had once made him crawl at his feet like a dog was sentenced to death by 1,000 cuts. Situ Changming's crown princess, that girl who had wanted to throw me into a well, Situ Qingshu specifically arranged for her to be cut in half at the waist. 2 bloody halves of a body were thrown into a dry well in the mass grave. As for Situ Yanran, Situ Qingshu bestowed upon her a cup of poisoned wine. I didn't understand what kind of threat a married princess posed to him. Situ Yanran's husband was unwilling to bury a criminal princess in the ancestral grave. So, Fan Yueming secretly brought her back from the mass grave and buried her in the late emperor's mausoleum. In my dreams that night, I saw her again as a child. A little girl as pretty as a porcelain doll, running on her short little legs and giggling at me. Situ Yanran, if there is a next life, be my sister. 10 years after the previous noble consort Chen died, another noble consort Chen was appointed in the palace. I was carried by a group of eunuchs, along with my bedding, into Yuchuan Palace, where my aunt had lived. The new empress came to see me. Born of a military family, she was vibrant and bold. She had a martial spirit. She put away her whip and dragged me to the imperial garden to watch her practice. She pretended to accidentally lash me with the whip. She ran over nervously, apologizing repeatedly. But unfortunately, I reached out to block it, so it didn't hit my face. I could see she was a bit disappointed. She observed me with shifting eyes, secretly comparing herself to me. I suddenly felt a bit sorry for her. This foolish girl had fallen for Situ Qingshu. She probably didn't know how she would end up dying. The one who came to see me that night was still Fan Yueming. She frowned with heartache and gently applied medicine to me. Over the years, I had always tried to search through my blurred childhood memories for my father's face. But no matter how hard I tried to remember, the face that ultimately surfaced in my mind was always Fan Yueming's. In 10 years, I had grown up, and she had grown old. Looking at the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes and the white hair at her temples, my nose felt a bit stingy. With her talent, she could have been a great general or minister. But now, no matter how powerful she was only someone being cursed behind her back. As a traitorous minister and a castrated dog, Lord Feng, please let me see Situ Changming. I sniffed and leaned my head gently on her shoulder. Don't worry, I won't tell Situ Qingshu. She let out a long sigh. I knew she had agreed. Before dawn, I put on ordinary cotton clothes and carried a basket of freshly made peach blossom cakes. Someone blindfolded me with a black cloth and stuffed me into a carriage, which drove out of the palace along a winding route. The carriage traveled silently on the bumpy mountain road. I took note of every turn and uphill slope, vaguely guessing it was Mount Laojun in the suburbs. After the blindfold was removed, what met my eyes was a desolate temple. I pushed open the door and saw a young man, sitting on the ground, tied with iron chains. His face was pale, and a thin layer of stubble had grown on his chin. His worn-out robe was covered in dust. The sunlight from outside suddenly shone into the dim room. He turned his face to avoid it, raising his hand uncomfortably to shade his eyes. When he finally recognized me, he began to laugh. Your Grace, the noble consort, long time no see. He deliberately emphasized the words noble consort, likely mocking me for my efforts. That failed to make me empress in the end. I apologize to your Qin family on behalf of my grandfather, but now that the Lu family has fallen to this state, I suppose we are even. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled at him, then crouched down to open the food box, and held it out to him. Situ Changming, are you hungry? I made these fresh when I got up at the 4th watch. Have a taste. The smile faded from his face, his pupils shrinking slightly. He stared at me gloomily. Did Situ Qingshu send you to send me on my way? My mind was a bit slow after 10 days of fever. It took me a while to understand what he meant. I took out a peach blossom cake, took a bite and swallowed it, then held the remaining half before his eyes. Mumbling, I said, see? It's not poisonous. His eyes suddenly turned red, and the veins under the scar on his forehead bulged. He raised his hand and knocked the food box violently to the ground. The iron chains on his wrists clattered loudly. The peach blossom cakes in the box all rolled into the dirt. Chen Wanqing, is it fun to toy with me? He shouted with a red neck, his voice a hoarse roar. I pulled back my hand in fear. It's not fun, it's really not fun. I seemed to snap to my senses instantly. I gave him an apologetic smile, biting my lip to keep myself from crying. I picked up all the dirt-covered peach blossom cakes and put them back into the food box, then stood up and bowed to him. I kept my head down, not daring to look into his eyes again. Before I turned to leave, I felt as if I were in a cold shadow. There was a faint, familiar aura of killing intent. The amulet on my chest seemed to be glowing with a faint heat. Situ Yenran. It's your Ajio. He survived. I rubbed my eyes and looked up at the midday sun, remembering many years ago, those eyes that were as warm and bright as a little sun. In fact, I knew that on the day I was pressed against the well, it was Situ Changming who had Ajio save me. I always remembered that I owed him a life, and one day, I would pay it back. After returning to the palace, having pretended to be mute for so many years, I seemed to have truly become one. At first, Situ Qingshu often came to see me, and would say many things to me, but I just smiled quietly, never saying a word. In the first month, he flew into a rage out of humiliation. In the second month, he begged me in tears. By the third month, he would just sit there in a daze for a while before leaving, and then, he stopped coming. I knew he was busy cultivating his own power, busy sidelining Fang Yueming and the guards. During every lonely night in his youth, the strategies he silently absorbed, the praises, the humiliations, and the martial arts he secretly learned. All of it became his armor and claws during this time. Everyone began to look differently at the second prince, who was once thought of as simple-minded and foolish. The youth who was once trampled in the mud had become a formidable emperor. The price he paid was known only to himself. Everyone advised me not to be stubborn with him. Even Fang Yueming and Empress Hu came several times to act as mediators. In truth, it's not that I couldn't understand everything he did. I was just too tired. I didn't have the strength to keep walking beside him. This palace used obsession to trap everyone inside, chasing what cannot be had, losing what was once gained. What was the point? All I wanted was a simple, peaceful life. He and I were destined to take different paths. Sometimes I would leave my hair down and wander aimlessly through the palace grounds. I walked past the courtyard where I first met Situ Qingshu. I walked past the high pavilion where Situ Changming had secretly taken me to climb. I walked past the large tree outside Fengyi Palace where Situ Yenran was caught. Occasionally, I would run into Situ Qingshu. I neither bowed nor stepped aside. Acting as if I saw nothing, I would walk straight ahead, brushing past him. The palace servants all said noble consort Chen had gone mad, scared senseless by the previous palace coup. I smiled and silently accepted it, never offering a rebuttal. So, even when Empress Hu miscarried her 3-month-old child and searched the entire harem for the culprit, she only glanced at me and said, "It wouldn't be you." In only half a year, the lively girl who used to brandish a whip had grown so thin her face was sunken. Her hollow, resentful gaze swept over me, reminding me of the late empress. But she was clearly the same age as me, only 17 after the new year. The winter this year was exceptionally cold. Silver wire charcoal was lit in Yuchuan Palace. It was the best charcoal in the palace, burning without a trace of smoke. But I always felt it wasn't as warm as the black charcoal Situ Qingshu used to burn for me in his small hut. With ice-cold hands and feet, I crawled under the covers and drifted off into a daze. When I woke in the middle of the night, I felt warm all over. It was only then I realized there was another person in the bed. One of my hands was tucked inside a warm palm. It was the Situ Qingshu from 10 years ago, here to warm the bed for me again. While he was sound asleep, I carefully turned on my side and gave him a secret kiss on the cheek. I knew he would leave quietly before dawn and become that high and mighty emperor again. An emperor must have no weaknesses. Just as he once told me, no one is on guard against a fool. Then, surely no one would believe that a madwoman could be his Achilles heel. My Situ Qingshu. It must be so hard for him. But what I could do for him was really far too little. The weather gradually warmed. Reports from the border soldiers reached the capital. I heard the barbarian Khan had taken advantage of the new rain to cause trouble in the south. In the southern army, a general surnamed Li had repelled the invading enemy. There was also a brave young officer making a name for himself. I knew this General Li. He was my father's most trusted subordinate. Because he was implicated in my father's case, he had been buried in obscurity until now. If Chen Ping'an were still alive, he would surely be clamoring for General Li to take him to the front to kill enemies. Once spring began, General Li would lead his elite troops to Luoyang to receive rewards. The date was set for the 15th of the third month. The atmosphere in the palace, however, became strange. It reminded me of the stifling air before that heavy rainstorm last summer. For many days, I hadn't seen Situ Qingshu or Fang Yueming. Empress Hu also locked herself in Fengyi Palace and wouldn't come out. Even the usually gossipy palace servants were as quiet as cicadas in winter. It was as if everyone was waiting in tacit silence for a storm to break. But no one expected the upheaval to come early. On the third day of the third month, the sun was lovely. I pulled out all my old things one by one, planning to set them in the courtyard to air out. The two young maids who usually served me came running in, crying and screaming, and collapsed at my feet, before I could even hear what they were saying. Two people walked in through the door. Soldiers carrying long, bloody swords. The uniforms they wore were not from the Imperial Guard. That terrifying aura of killing intent could only come from soldiers who had bled on the frontier. They wordlessly cupped their hands in a salute to me. Then, each grabbed a maid and dragged them outside, slitting their throats like slaughtering chickens. Situ Qingshu had finally found a weapon he could use to finally remove those last two obstacles today. I stepped over the corpses of the maids at the door and ran toward the Imperial study. Along the way, scattered Imperial guards and eunuchs were still desperately resisting, but in the end, it was all in vain. The door to the Imperial study was wide open. Soldiers of the Jinbei army formed a neat circle, their cold, gleaming blades pointed steadily at the man surrounded in the middle. I desperately pushed through the tightly packed soldiers. General Li, who was standing to the side, waved his hand and let me through. At first glance, I didn't recognize him. He knelt on one knee, leaning on a broken sword, blood seeping from countless wounds all over his body, staining his light-colored robes dark red. I walked up softly, knelt, and wrapped my arms around his neck, whispering Fan Yueming in his ear. His tense body suddenly went limp, and he collapsed heavily into my arms. Warm blood poured out through my fingers. He stared fixedly at me, his eyes, clouded with blood, lighting up for a moment. Situ Qingshu. He has succeeded. He managed a difficult, wry smile. The task you entrusted to me. I have finally finished it. I swallowed the sob in my throat, and said with a smile, thank you. He closed his eyes, satisfied. A moment later, he suddenly used what strength he had left to hook his arm around my neck, bringing his lips to my ear. With a weak voice, he said, go, to Situ Changming, quickly. He's going after Situ Changming. My heart began to pound wildly. A key was pressed into my hand. I quietly hid it in my sash. General Li and his soldiers carried away Fan Yueming's body. Once there was no one left around, I immediately took off my blood-stained outer robe and changed into the clothes of a maid who had fainted nearby. Hiding and dodging all the way, I ran to the back of the cold palace and crawled out through a dog hole. In the market, I used a gold hairpin to trade for a horse. Avoiding the soldiers on the street, I galloped as fast as I could toward Mount Laojun. When I reached the foot of the mountain, I fell from the horse's back and leaned against a tree, vomiting uncontrollably. Fortunately, the Jinbei army hadn't searched this far yet. There was still time. Following the route in my memory, I stumbled my way up the mountain. Finally, before my strength was completely gone, I found that temple. The temple gate was suddenly pushed open. When Situ Changming saw me, he snapped, what are you doing here again? Though he was grumbling and cursing, his arm steadily caught me as I collapsed from exhaustion. Panting heavily, I struggled out of his embrace, pulled out the key, and with trembling hands, unlocked the chains on his wrists and ankles. He looked at me in confusion. Wan Jing, what are you doing? I didn't have time to explain. Situ Changming, Fan Yueming is dead. Situ Qingshu is coming to kill you. Put on my clothes and leave immediately. In a frantic rush, I stripped off my outer robe and skirt, reaching out to pull at his collar. We leave together. He grabbed my wrist, his face flushing red. His normally gloomy eyes were suddenly terrifyingly bright. There was no time, I was sweating with anxiety. I shouted loudly, Ah Jiao, come out. A young man dressed in gray leapt down from the rafters. He wasn't masked. He was lean and handsome, but those indifferent, emotionless eyes allowed me to recognize him instantly. I shot him a meaningful look. He understood immediately and knocked Situ Changming unconscious with a swift strike. The two of us hurriedly stripped his clothes and clumsily dressed him in my skirt and robe. Ah Jiao hoisted him onto his shoulder. I took off the amulet around my neck and pressed it into Ah Jiao's hand. Ah Jiao, this belonged to Situ Yanran. You should keep it. His eyes turned red in an instant. He pressed his lips together and nodded to me. I reached out and smoothed Situ Changming's messy hair, taking one last look at him. Goodbye, Situ Changming. Go and live a simple, free life for me. Ah Jiao bowed deeply to me, then turned and carried Situ Changming toward the back of the mountain. Just as mother had dressed me in my brother's clothes back then, I put on Situ Changming's robe, tied up my hair, and sat down quietly. After a short while, a series of footsteps sounded outside. The door was kicked open. A broad-shouldered, long-legged young general stood at the entrance, gesturing to the messengers behind him to wait, then quickly walked toward me. His skin was dark, but his features were delicate. A hideous scar stretched from his jaw down to his neck. If I hadn't seen the familiar red birthmark on the back of his hand, I almost wouldn't have recognized him. He narrowed his eyes and sized me up, then frowned in annoyance. It's a woman. I was thrown to the ground, watching him turn to leave. I took out the half of the poisonous silver needle the Empress Dowager had left me, from the seam of my undergarment and bit down, then called out to him. Chen Ping'an, you're back. His footsteps froze, and his body swayed violently. He turned back and looked at me in disbelief. How do you know my name? He strode over, grabbed my shoulders, and shook me hard. Who are you? I bit my lip and looked at him silently. He seemed even more short-tempered than when he was a child, his eyes like a burning fire. My brother is still alive. That's wonderful. He stared at me for a long time. Then, as if struck by lightning, he frantically pulled open my collar to reveal the birthmark below my collarbone. In an instant, his tears gushed out like melting blood. His voice trembled violently. Wan Jing, is it really you? You're alive? My chest began to hurt intensely. I couldn't stand steadily and collapsed against him. Brother, why did it take you so long to find me? Wan Jing wants to go home. I managed to force a small smile and reached out to touch his rough cheek. He must have suffered so much these 10 years. He fell to his knees with a thud, holding me so tightly in his arms that I could barely breathe. Wan Jing, I'm sorry. It was brother's fault. Brother will protect you properly from now on. I won't let you suffer anymore. The iron-willed young general cried so hard he was blowing bubbles from his nose. One must know, he never cried when we were little. He is my own brother. Although I liked to be stubborn with him, I also truly loved him. I often thought, if mother had asked for my opinion back then, perhaps I would have been willing to die for him. Brother, do you remember? You owe me a life. You also owe me a tiger head lantern, 18 peach blossom cakes, and a bamboo dragonfly. Return them all to me today. My chest hurt terribly. My internal organs felt as if they were being ground up. A trickle of bloody foam flowed from the corner of my mouth. What's wrong with you? Medic. Quickly, call the medic. His face was pale, his heart racing with panic as he shouted toward the door. I grabbed his hand, struggling to lean close to his ear. I owe Situ Changming a life. Let him go. Then we'll be even. Okay? Promise me. He looked at me with tear-filled eyes. His handsome face crumpled in a mess. After a long silence, he finally nodded. I felt a sense of relief, and suddenly felt all the strength being drained from my body. So, dying feels this uncomfortable. But then there was another shot. A chaotic set of footsteps approached from afar. Wan Jing, why are you here? I've killed everyone surnamed Hu. Come and be my empress, okay? I forced my heavy eyelids open with effort, and saw Situ Qingshu's panicked and bewildered face. Smiling was hard. I told you long ago. I wanted to marry you. If he knew I had let Situ Changming go, he would surely be very angry, wouldn't he? But it didn't matter. I had already punished myself for him. A large gulp of blood poured from my mouth. Situ Qingshu tightly held my cold hand. I sadly realized that I still missed the warmth of his palm. Wan Jing, what's happening to you? Don't scare me. I only have you now. Only you. He cried until his eyes were red. Just like that ugly rabbit he gave me years ago. Suddenly my heart softened, and I spoke the last lie of my life. Situ Qingshu. Maybe in the next life. In our next life, I'll marry you again. My consciousness grew more and more blurred, and my body felt light as air. Memories began to spin like a carousel. One moment, I was having a snowball fight with my brother. The next, I was huddled with Situ Qingshu under a cold blanket, whispering secrets. Then, I was walking with Situ Changming through the brightly lit streets of a spring night. Finally, I saw mother standing under a blooming peach tree, smiling at me through her tears. Before sending me on to the prisoner cart, she had hugged me tightly. And in my ear, she said gently, Wan Jing, don't be afraid. Mother is waiting for you down there. Mother, Wan Jing has thought about it for 10 years and finally decided to forgive you. Even if it couldn't compare to brother. Mother loved me very much too, right? Just as I loved Situ Qingshu. And loved Situ Changming and Situ Yanran as well. My Situ Qingshu. In your next life, you must find a girl who is more capable than me. Wan Jing is a useless girl. And needs to go home early. Mother, are you still waiting for me? I am Chen Ping'an. I don't remember much before my sister was born. I only remember that I didn't like her much for the first 2 years. Father was away from home most of the time and mother spent all day centered around that little pink bundle. I thought secretly back then, it would be better if she wasn't here. Then mother would be mine alone forever. But, when she grabbed my hand with her chubby little one, the softest part of my heart seemed to be struck instantly. The little pink bundle was actually quite cute. Once she learned to walk, she spent all day like a little duck, with her 2 short little legs, waddling along behind me. Brother, I took her to fly kites and have snowball fights. Seeing her rosy little face, standing under the peach blossom tree, I suddenly felt that having a sister was actually pretty good. But as she grew older, she began to get annoying. She always liked to fight me for things. She often complained that our parents favored me, but I didn't feel that way at all. On the contrary, I often heard adults talk about how men were superior to women. I felt more and more that she was being unreasonable. Clearly, I was the only heir of the Marquis mansion, while she was just a girl who would get married off sooner or later. What right did she have to compete with me? so I began to deliberately go against her. Sometimes when I bullied her too much, she would run away crying. But early the next morning, she would still come with eyes swollen from crying, to wake me up. Looking at her red eyes, a sudden sting hit my heart. The pain made me wake up instantly. Forget superiority, all I knew was that I loved her. She was my sister. The girl I should protect with my life. But by the time I realized it, it was already too late. I will always remember that autumn afternoon when I was 9. A group of government soldiers burst into my home. My sister was nowhere to be found. Mother frantically dressed me in my sister's clothes. The clothes were too small, restricting my arms so I couldn't stretch. I asked, "Where's Wanqing?" Mother told me with red eyes, "Ping'an. Wanqing traded her life for yours. You must live well." I looked down at the skirt I was wearing. It still carried my sister's scent. I was dazed for a moment. The soldiers kicked open the courtyard gate. Mother drew the short sword hanging on the wall and pushed me out of the room with force. I saw a splash of blood on the window screen. Then, 2 soldiers dragged Mother's body out. Her unclosed eyes seemed to still be looking at me. On the way to the Jiafangxi, someone secretly rescued me and took me into the Jinbei army. Only then did I realize I no longer had a home. My parents and sister were all dead. I was the only one left in this world. I lived under an assumed name. I served as a lowly soldier under General Li. 10 years of snow on the battlefields felt as though they would never end. I lost count of the times I escaped death, covered in wounds. During the most grueling moments, I always remembered that my life was given to me by Wanqing. No matter how hard it was, I had to survive, waiting for the day I could have my revenge. Finally, on an early autumn morning, news arrived from Luoyang. My cousin Situ Qingshu had ascended the throne, and the Chen family's name was finally cleared. We received a secret decree from Situ Qingshu. General Li was my father's most loyal subordinate, and one of the few men he could trust. After driving back the northern invaders, we finally had a reason to march on Luoyang. In the 3rd month of spring, within the gentle, warm breeze, there was a misplaced scent of blood. I never expected to see Wanqing again in such a way. When that familiar birthmark below her collarbone caught my eye, an overwhelming wave of grief and joy instantly shattered my reason. My Wanqing, she was still alive. 10 years of time had transformed her into a beautiful young woman. It made me realize how much I owed her. Fate had been kind to me, returning Wanqing to my side. I told myself in my heart that I owed her a life, and I would spend the rest of mine repaying it. But in the next moment, she collapsed into my arms, her face pale as death. She listed everything I owed her from when we were kids. The little girl had such a good memory. I had forgotten all those trivial matters, but she remembered them all so clearly. Blood trickled from her mouth as she begged me to let Situ Changming go. Just as she had traded her life for mine as a child, she was now trading it for another man. I agreed. It was what I owed her. I watched helplessly as she died in my arms. After 10 years apart, she gave me not even a moment to make amends. To find only to lose again. To have the jade ring but no one to wear it. No sorrow in this world is greater than this. A subordinate reported that a suspicious man at Xuanda Gate was carrying a girl dressed like a man out of the city. I waved my hand and let them go. I followed Situ Qingshu along the road strewn with corpses. In the room where she had lived, I opened a small box. Inside was a crudely made rabbit lamp. It bore traces of glue and tape, as if it had been shattered, and then painstakingly pieced back together. Situ Qingshu held the rabbit and wailed loudly. I sat outside the door and waited for him all night. The grief in the wind was enough to break one's heart. At the break of dawn, he finally emerged. His face was like ash, his beard unkempt, and he didn't say a word for 3 whole days. I took Wanqing home. In the courtyard where we lived as children, I buried her alongside our parents. I planted a new peach blossom tree by her grave. I left a tiger head lamp, a bamboo dragonfly, and 18 peach blossom cakes. Situ Qingshu personally returned everything that was owed, and compensated me for everything. General Li became the commander, while I became the youngest great general, with the right to enter the palace freely. When no one else was around, Situ Qingshu would call me Big Brother. In Wanqing's place, I became his closest kin. 10 years ago, I followed tradition, marrying and having children. But he spent his time searching for girls who resembled Wanqing. One day, I went to the imperial study to report military affairs. A concubine pushed open the door and left, weeping. I saw Situ Qingshu sitting dejectedly in the middle of the empty hall. He murmured with hollow eyes. "They're not like her. Not at all. Wanqing is Wanqing." I had no words to comfort him. Had I myself ever spent a single day without missing her? Situ Qingshu was not even 30. Yet his spirit was already withered, his hair turning gray. He was often dazed and lost. He didn't even attend the palace examination for the top 3 scholars. This year's top scholar was named Qingwan. Before officially taking office, he entered the imperial study to have an audience with the emperor. I stood beside Situ Qingshu and watched the handsome young scholar stride in with his head held high. His bearing was certainly not that of a commoner. He stopped at a distance and bowed, but he did not kneel. His dark eyes stared straight at Situ Qingshu. In a deep voice, he said, Situ Qingshu. It's been a long time. Situ Qingshu's clouded eyes suddenly lit up with a terrifying intensity. He stood up abruptly from behind his desk and leaned forward. Situ Changming. It's you. You dare to return? Aren't you afraid I'll kill you? The man below the steps curled his lips into a smile. Situ Qingshu. It's been 10 years. Have you made no progress at all? Do you still only know how to kill? Rest assured, I have no interest in your throne. He shook his head and sighed bitterly. I promised Wan Qing that I would make Dazhou a prosperous and strong nation. You aren't doing a good enough job. I'm here to help you. This was the man Wan Qing gave her life for. Situ Changming took the name Qingwan and rose step by step to become the prime minister. Yet he never married. For 20 years, Dazhou enjoyed peace and prosperity. In the 10th year of Xuanhe, Situ Qingshu passed away, and a new emperor ascended the throne. One day in March, Situ Changming came to my estate to find me. He said to me, Brother Chen, it's time for us to leave. I understood in my heart. The way the new emperor looked at us was already full of wariness. It was time to retire while we were ahead. So Situ Changming and I resigned and returned to our hometown. I brought him to the courtyard where Wan Qing was buried. The peach blossom tree I planted by her grave back then was now tall and broad like a canopy, its blossoms like clouds. He smiled as he touched her tombstone. His voice as gentle as the March spring breeze. Wan Qing, I have finished everything you asked of me. 3 years later, he died under that tree. I buried him by Wan Qing's side. Many more years passed, and I too finally grew old and dim-sighted. Amidst the drifting peach blossom rain, I seemed to see the 7-year-old Wan Qing standing under the tree, smiling at me. I transformed back into my 9-year-old self and reached out my hand to her. In the spring breeze of another year, I finally held her in my arms once more.